Good morning, everyone. Good morning to the third day of sessions of the United Nations Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum, and a very warm welcome to the session Policy Developments in Japan and Their Impact on Asia. My name is Livio Sarandrea, and I am the Global Advisor on Business and Human Rights for UNDP. I'm very happy to see here a large presence of Japanese actors, as well as I recognized many delegations that I met during the first 2 days of the forum. I do see delegations, I recognize delegations from Nepal, from Lao PDR, from India, Indonesia, Malaysia. I've seen colleagues from Maldives, Vietnam, Pakistan. So I hope this will be a very good opportunity for representatives of other states in Asia to know more about the policy developments happening in Japan. We don't often organize sessions or forums with specific country focus. Normally we organize sessions that are more thematic in nature. However, the recent positive policy developments in Japan deserve, in our opinion, dedicated attention for the impact that they will have, obviously, in Japan, but the ripples that they will send also around across supply chains in Asia and, in fact, much beyond Asia. The adoption of the guidelines on respect for human rights in responsible supply chains, of which we'll hear a lot more today, send a very powerful message to companies, to the suppliers of these companies, to their partners, calling for business operations to respect people and the planet at all times. These guidelines reaffirm and strengthen, in fact, the commitment which the government of Japan had already taken on the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights by adopting a national action plan in 2020. We discussed a lot during the first 2 days of deliberations of these forums around normative developments, be it of soft or harder nature, the discussions around mandatory human rights due diligence in the EU. It was a very frequent subject that occurred in many of the sections. With the adoption of these guidelines of Japanese policies on responsible business practices, Japan is now much more aligned with other large economies that have taken action on adopting policies on responsible business practices, and many more of these policies are, as we all know, coming up. Importantly, this is very important to say in this context, in this very building, of course, the House of the Secretariat of the United Nations. With these steps, the government of Japan also reaffirms its pledge to support sustainable development, because by far preventing and addressing adverse impacts across business activities and value chain is the most significant contribution that companies can make toward the achievements of the target of the 2030 agenda. And in that sense, the government of Japan signals and expectations that companies do play their role. Now, of this and other issues, I'm honored to be able to speak today with an exceptional panel of experts and analysts and practitioners on business and human rights, which I would like to introduce one by one first, and then I will give the floor to each of them to make some remarks or to respond to some questions. So in doing these introductions, let me start with our guest of honor today. In fact, guest of honor for the entire forum, I should say. We are honored by the presence of Mr. Gen Nakatani, who is Special Advisor to Prime Minister of Japan for International Human Rights. Sincere thanks, Mr. Nakatani, for taking the time to join us in person at the forum. It's really, really appreciated. I will give you the floor in a moment for your important keynote reflections that will kick us off. And your kickoff, your keynote reflection will be followed by a panel discussion, which will include, and here I'm introducing the other experts who joined us today, Mr. Hiroki Matsui on the right side, who is Senior Coordinator of Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs Division of the Foreign Policy Bureau of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Government of Japan. Thank you, Mr. Hiroki, for joining us. Also on my right side, Professor Anita Ramasastry, Henry M. Jackson Professor of Law, University of Washington School of Law, but also very well known to most of us, well known worldwide also as a former member, as a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights until very recently. It's always a pleasure, Professor Ramasastry, to have you with us. And then I'd like to introduce on the left side at the end, Ms. Runvari Suwanmongonkol, Secretary General of the Securities and Exchange Commission of the Royal Thai Government. Thank you, Runvari, for being with us. And then a representative from the business sector, from the largest business association of Japan, which is Keidanren. Mr. Masayo Seki is joining us, and Masao Seki is the chair of the task force on Keidanren's Charter of Corporate Behavior, and is also a senior advisor of the Sustainability Department of Sompo Japan Insurance, Inc. Thank you, Mr. Masao Seki, for joining us. Last but not least, on my left side here, Dr. Dina Prapto Raraja, who is a senior policy advisor of the Foundation for International Human Rights Reporting Standards, but also previously a representative for the government of Indonesia at the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. So with no further ado, let's get to the substance of our discussion. And in that regard, I kindly ask Mr. Gen Nakatani to take the floor from the podium and offer to us some keynote remarks. Please, Mr. Nakatani.
Good morning. I am Gen Nakatani from Government of Japan. Please listen to my voice through your receiver interpreter, English one. ご出席の皆様、日本政府で国際人権問題担当総理補佐官を務めております、中谷源でございます。私のポストは、人権をはじめとする普遍的価値を守り抜くということを重視をしております、岸田内閣の下で、昨年末に初めて設置をされました。今回、UNDP が主催するイベントで、この日本の取り組みを紹介する機会を得たということを大変光栄に存じております。人権や自由、民主主義、法の支配といった普遍的価値はいかなる国でも尊重されるべきものであり、人権擁護はすべての国の基本的な責務です。一方で、人権状況の改善は一朝一夕に成し得るものではありません。日本は深刻な人権侵害に対してはっきり声を上げる、しっかりと声を上げる。一方で、各国の歴史的な経緯を尊重し、二国間対話を通じて、相手方の意見に耳を傾け、協力を積み重ねることで、各国の自主的な取り組みを後押ししてまいりました。日本は国連をはじめとする多国間での取り組み、また二国間でのさまざまな協力を通じまして、アジア太平洋地域および国際社会の人権の状況の改善に引き続き 貢献をしていく決意でございます。本セッションを主催する UNDP と日本政府は、互いに重要なパートナーとして、開発現場でのプロジェクト実施や政策提言、さらに日本政府主導のアフリカ開発会議 TIGAD をはじめとするさまざまな国際会議の開催など、さまざまに共同いたしております。この場を借りまして、長年にわたります UNDP のご協力に心から感謝を表します。特に開発途上国における人権状況を改善していくためには、その国の経済状況を考慮した取り組みが必要であります。サプライチェーンが世界中に複雑に展開をされ、あらゆる場面で人権尊重への取り組みが一層求められている中で、企業の社会的責任の議論と合わせ、企業活動における人権尊重の取り組みが求められております。国連人権理事会で支持されたビジネスと人権に関する指導原則に基づき、すでに20カ国以上が国別行動計画を策定をいたしております。特に欧米では、法規制によって企業に人権尊重を義務付ける動きも活発化しております。こうした背景を踏まえて、日本政府は国連のビジネスと人権に関する指導原則を着実に履行すべく、2020年にビジネスと人権に関する行動計画を策定しました。そして、同計画に基づく取り組みを一層加速するために、2021年12月には、私のもとに省庁横断的な会議を立ち上げ、関係省庁間の連携を深めております。この会議では、行動計画のフォローアップのための作業方法の検討、企業における人権デューデリデンスの導入、国際的な動向及び日本企業の取り組みの状況などについて意見交換を行っております。さらに、関係府省庁と企業や労働組合、NGO、アカデミア等のステークホルダーとの対話の場も設定し、政府における行動計画の実施状況の確認や見直し、広くビジネスと人権に関する取り組み全般にかかる意見交換も行っております。ステークホルダーの協力を得た取り組みの成果の一つが、9月13日に政府として策定をした責任あるサプライチェーン等における人権尊重のためのガイドラインです。このガイドラインは、その策定を望む企業の声、また政府が企業による人権尊重の取り組みを促すために、イニシアティブを取るよう期待するステークホルダーの声を受け、本年3月に立ち上げられた検討会で継続的に議論を行ってまいりました。検討会は、学術経験者、国際機関、主要団体、労働者団体、業界団体、関連 NGO 等の幅広いメンバーで構成をされて、5回にわたる議論を行いました。このガイドラインは、1、国連の指導原則、OECD、多国籍企業行動指針、ILO、多国籍企業及び社会政策にかかる原則の三者宣言といった権威ある国際スタンダードによりまして、また2、国際尊重に関する具体的な取り組み方法がわからないという企業に 答えたものであります。ガイドラインのポイントは次のとおりです。まず、人権尊重の取り組みについては、企業活動における人権の負の影響の防止、軽減、救済を目的とすべきことを明記をし、そうした取り組みが持続可能な経済、社会の実現に寄与すること、そして企業にとっては企業価値の向上がつながることなどを説明をし、企業に積極的な取り組みを促しております。また、ガイドラインは法的拘束力を有するものではないものの、企業の規模、業種等にかかわらず、日本で事業活動を行うすべての企業に対して、人権尊重の取り組みに最大限努めるということを明記をいたしております。さらに、ガイドラインにおいて、各企業は、自社グループ会社はもちろん、サプライチェーン上の企業やその他のビジネス上の取引先についても、人権デューデリデンスの対象とすべきことであるということを示しました。もちろん、間接の取引先も人権デューデリデンスの対象に含まれております。日本政府は、企業が積極的に人権尊重に取り組めるように、情報の提供、助言を行っていくということにしております。また、ガイドラインの策定と合わせて、企業が公平な競争条件の下で活動できるような予見性の高い事業環境を整備するために、各国との連携を深めております。国家として、人権尊重の取り組みを率先垂範するために、政府としましても、政府調達における人権尊重の仕組みづくりを検討する目的で、私のもとに関係省庁によるワーキンググループ、これを設置をしまして、議論を開始をするということにいたしました。日本政府は、すでに国際社会においても責任ある企業行動の促進支援を進めております。例えば、今年3月から来年3月まで UNDP を含む国際機関と連携をし、東南アジアを中心に日本企業が多く進出をしております17カ国において、人権リスクに関する調査、人権デューデリデンスの導入を促進するためのツールやガイダンスを提供しているほか、これらの各国によるビジネスと人権に関する行動計画の策定を支援をしております。ガイドラインが策定をされました今、さらにこのガイドラインの普及を通じまして、ASEAN をはじめとした海外における日本企業の事業活動、また日本企業と取引関係にある現地企業による人権デューデリデンスの普及促進をますます加速をさせたいと思っております。この後のパネルディスカッションにおきまして、日本のビジネスと人権に関する施策、政策の発展とアジアにおける影響、これをテーマに議論をされます。日本のガイドライン策定はまさに日本の政策の大きな進展です。ビジネスと人権の考え方の浸透や人権デューデリデンスの導入に関する日本の取り組みにつきまして、理解を深めていただきますことによりまして、海外での日本企業のビジネス展開がどのように変化をし、それが各国の社会、ビジネス、経済にどのような恩恵をもたらすのかということに思いを巡らしていくきっかけとなってくれれば幸いでございます。今後ともご要望がありましたら、行動計画、そしてガイドラインの策定につきまして、我が国の経験を共有するなどいたしまして、皆様方の取り組みをさらに支援してまいりたいと考えております。ご清聴どうもありがとうございました。Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Nakatani. Thank you for these very inspiring remarks. Thank you in particular for signaling the complementarity of actions of the government of Japan in adopting standards, in giving guidelines to businesses and indeed their suppliers and partners, but at the same time pairing that with those capacity building actions that are needed to transform that guidance into actual impact. And thank you for the very several references to UNDP. We are honored to have been chosen by the government of Japan to deliver trainings on human rights due diligence, as you said, in 17 countries. We are honored to be able to contribute to that effort, again, to pair capacity building solutions to the introduction of the guidelines and together translate that into impact. Now, this appetizer, so to speak, that as I would call it, on Nakatani-san on the guidelines, this initial introduction that you had given us, I'm sure made the participants here and indeed online. By the way, I'm told that we have almost 200 people also following us online. I'm sure that the participants would now be hungry for more details on the guidelines, on the content of the guidelines. So to get more details, I'm turning now to the first of our speakers in the panel, representatives again from the government of Japan, in this case from Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Matsui. Thank you very much for joining us. Matsui-san, the adoption of the guidelines from the government of Japan, as we have just heard from Mr. Nakatani, do represent a very significant milestone in the direction of achieving more responsible supply chains in Asia, and in fact, beyond. Would you like to illustrate briefly the guidelines? I haven't read the final ones because they're not translated in English, but I've read the last draft, which I'm told is not very different from the final one. The guidelines are quite detailed, and probably there's no time to go into all the details, but it would be very useful if you can illustrate the key highlights of the guidelines and perhaps tell us a little bit more of how the guidelines build and evolve somehow from the work that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan started when there was an adoption of the National Action Plan on business and human rights. So the floor is yours, Mr. Matsui. Thank you.
Thank you, Livio-san. So on behalf of the government of Japan, I would like to really appreciate, thank you for giving us to explain our newly established guideline. Just this guideline was only adopted last week. So now we are promoting, drafting the English version. So you may have in due course, but the essence, actually, I would like to contribute to today's panel discussion by providing further background of Japan's recent measures on business and human rights. Japan developed its NAP in October 2020. The background of formulating the NAP by Japan is as stated in the statement by Mr. Nakatani, Special Advisor to the Prime Minister. The copies of the NAP will be available actually in the foyer, the backside of this room, so you may be referred to it if interested. In the NAP, in line with the guidelines principles on business and human rights of the United Nations, the government expresses its expectation toward business enterprises to introduce the process of human rights due diligence and to engage in dialogue with stakeholders, including those in the supply chains. In my opinion, that NAP may have brought a change to the pattern of behavior of both Japanese government and business enterprises. Many Japanese, including me, actually, as government officials, like myself, recognize the importance of respecting human rights, but do not know what exactly we should do and to what extent. So in particular, we are easily at a loss to decide when we are told you don't have to aim for perfection from the beginning, but just prioritize where we can do it first. Or you can think about it while continuing dialogue with your stakeholders, which is very new kind of a style for the Japanese people, if I may say. So in fact, as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI, it's very famous, METI, so jointly conducted a survey from September to October last year among companies listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. Actually, 55% of respondents wanted guidelines to be developed that would point out what to do. In response to this, the government began its work in March this year, actually, for establishing the guidelines of respecting human rights in responsible supply chains, which was adopted last week at the meeting of the relevant government ministries, which was held under the auspice of Mr. Nakatani. So I would like to briefly introduce you the key points of the guidelines once again. So first, I think the next slide, please. Yes, the objective of the guidelines is to provide concrete and easy to understand explanation of the measures requested to the business enterprises for respecting human rights, based on the international standards such as the UN guideline principles, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and a tri-party declaration of principles concerning multilateral enterprises and social policy, or MNE declaration of ILO. So taking the reality of business enterprises operating in Japan into consideration. So this helps business enterprises deepen their understandings and promotes efforts for respecting human rights. With regard to the scope, the next slide, please. Yes, thank you. With regard to the scope of the business enterprises, this guideline covers all companies engaging in business activities in Japan, regardless of size or sector. Individual companies are advised to expand its efforts not only to their own, but also group companies, suppliers, companies in their own supply chains, and other business partners in Japan and abroad. So this is not limited to their direct business partners. And the next is the scope of human rights. As for the scope of human rights in the guideline, the human rights to be respected by business enterprises are defined as internationally recognized human rights, and especially include at a minimum those expressed in the International Bill of Human Rights and the principles relating to the fundamental rights listed in the ILO Declaration and fundamental principles and principles and rights at work. As shown in this slide, at taking measures for respecting human rights, commitments at management level is extremely important. And it should be noted that the potential adverse impacts exist in any business enterprises. Dialogue with stakeholders and approach based on priorities and collaboration with other business enterprises are all important. So it is easy to talk, I guess, but difficult to understand what we should actually implement with all this. In fact, during the discussion for formulating the guideline in Japan, so many comments were proposed. If we require business enterprises to introduce due diligence, they might be criticized by civil society for not doing enough. Or the state, instead of companies, should assess country or industrial sector risks. It is not my role today to provide answers to these arguments, so I will not respond, But I would like to just point out what I think is important. It is that, for example, referring to the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, each business enterprise bears responsibility to identify and address adverse impacts, and they will not be exempt from this responsibility per se, regardless of the nature and extent of the efforts for promoting the due diligence by them. Rather, the fact that the government expects business enterprises to implement due diligence should not be regarded as the government shifts the responsibility to business enterprises, nor do any business enterprises shift the responsibility to other enterprises in the chain of the business relationship that are directly linked to the adverse impact. Information on adverse impacts may be obtained from a variety of sources, including governments, international organizations, civil society, workers, employers, media, and academia. So I would like to say that the process of scoping and identifying adverse impacts are the shared responsibility among society as a whole. So to continue such efforts based on the constant exchange of opinions and information is so difficult that it forces Japanese to change the way of behavior. So this is actually, this is kind of my personal impression on the process of making this guidelines. So finally, I would like to introduce my personal views on the possible impacts of Japan as requested policy on business and human rights to international community, including Asia. So first, yes, this is the last slide of mine. The first, as Minister Nakatani stated, the government of Japan will support Asian countries through seminars on implementation or the formulation of due diligence by utilizing our own experience and knowledge. This may lead to raise awareness on the implementation of human rights due diligence in this region. This will enhance efforts by Asian countries for business and human rights. As a result, I believe the human rights situation across this region will be improved in a way that is appropriate to the culture or history and economic situation of each country. Second, through the implementation of this guideline, the government hopes that Japanese business enterprises deepen their understandings of business and human rights and further introduce the process of human rights due diligence. So we hope this entails that the human rights due diligence will be carried out by subsidiaries and business partners of Japanese companies in Asian countries, where many Japanese business enterprises are active here. So this may bring Asian countries a chance to promote sustainable and responsible corporate activities. So in turn, this region as a whole will be recognized as a trusted trading partner in global economy with international competitiveness. So I will leave here and kick off the discussion by saying this. Thank you.
Thank you, Matsui-san. Thank you, and what a good kickoff to the discussion indeed. Thank you for a clear illustration of the highlights of the guidelines. I think your message was also clear and important on the fact that those guidelines apply to all companies, irrespective of their size. The message was clear on these guidelines applying across supply chains, which makes it so important then as a message to be delivered here today. thank you for putting the accent on another thing which was debated already and raised in a number of times, including in sessions in this forum on day 1 and 2, the importance of the commitment and I should say responsibility of the senior management, the importance of the leadership of the companies playing an important role. Here again, I see a strong alignment also with the upcoming norms from the EU, which also places a strong accent on the responsibility of the leadership. And of course, thank you for talking about the criticality of stakeholders' engagement, without which human rights due diligence cannot take place. Lastly, one more thing I want to single out because I think is important and is a message that I hope, especially the governments, some of which again I see represented here today, listen to, is the idea of, you say, don't aim for perfections, which is what we also sometimes say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I know that some governments, considering National Action Plan on Basic Human Rights, are worried of trying to find that final formula, the final text that encompasses it all. And it's very difficult to find. Prioritization is important. The NAPs are, as the working group already said many times, documents that are there to be continually revised. So that I think was an important message. Now, with this great introduction from Mr. Matsue, I would like now to turn to Professor Ramasastry. Anita, I know you've been a very close observer of the policy developments in Japan. In fact, you've been advising some of this processes as well, from the adoption of the NAP to the recent launching of these guidelines. Now, how do you see these important additional directions that the government of Japan is offering, when combined, what I was making reference to earlier, combined with mandatory requirements, coming from a number of EU member states, upcoming from EU as a whole, other norms that we see adopted in the US. Now, all these new norms of soft and harder nature, so how do you see this impacting the work of not only Japanese companies, but also the one of thousands of suppliers of these companies and partners here in Asia? Anita, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to thank you, Livio, UNDP, the UN Working Group, and the organizers for the invitation to come back. It's wonderful to be here with so many colleagues. And Mr. Nakatani, congratulations to the government of Japan, but also to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and to METI for this strong commitment that you are sharing with us today. It's very important. So let me reflect, and again, some of you may wonder, although I think Livio explained, why is an American law professor speaking about developments in Japan and Asia? As a law professor on the west coast of the US in Seattle, I've had the great honor over decades of my career to work very actively in Japan on issues of responsible business. And I had the good fortune and privilege to work along with my colleague, Professor Surya Dev, when we were on the working group with Japan on its journey for 6 years with the National Action Plan first, and more recently the guidelines, and will continue as an academic to work with Japanese colleagues. But let me just say that there are challenges. So we first have to say, the UN Working Group called this next decade of the guiding principles the decade of action. And so these commitments, I think, are part of that decade of action. And we need leadership from the top, as well as civil society, reflecting not from the bottom, but reflecting actually from real experience what we need. So we need everybody, and we need governments. So Japan is significant, of course, because it is a significant leader economically and politically in Asia, but it is also a member of the G7, and we cannot underestimate the power of the G7, which cuts across global geographies. And of course, Japan is a member of the OECD and has strong ties and relationships in the ASEAN partnership as well. So all of this means that Japan should, and I hope will, continue to lead. This is my first message. But now to the challenges, and this is, I think, what we all have to deal with. The UN Guiding Principles gives us a common language. After a decade, business, government, and civil society now have some words and ideas that they can all use to talk about this. Local context is important, but we should always try to use that same language and to ensure at least a minimum level of consistency in what we do. So it is very important as these different efforts, the treaty discussion, mandatory due diligence in the European Union, forced labor rules in the US and other countries, that we don't have so many different frameworks that we lose the common language. This is my key message, and it's my message that I give to governments very often. So we have challenges, and I would say Japan can lead as when it chairs the G7, because right now we have a strong commitment from the G7 governments, the trade ministers, the labor ministers, even finance, to dealing with supply chains. But the commitments are happening in different shapes. So the United States is probably going to be the last with due diligence, but it has these new strong trade measures on forced labor. EU and Germany are focusing on mandatory human rights due diligence, and Germany is in fact encouraging governments to participate in the UN binding treaty process. And now we have new guidelines from Japan. So we have different avenues, different roads. Those roads need to be consistent, and we hope over time will lead to a common binding standard. So Japan's leadership is very important, and there will be, I think, a challenge. The second is about the guidelines, and just some ideas for moving forward. As we've heard from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it's a very important development and very comprehensive. So what more? If we think of the civil society expectations, some suggestions for the future for METI, for MOFA, to clarify the guidelines. The first is on stakeholders, very important. The current guidelines, and I've only seen an unofficial translation, asks for dialogue with stakeholders. We need to remember that this is not optional, it must be mandatory, and that stakeholders include not just workers and community, but all rights holders connected to the business activity. And it must be done. We cannot identify human rights harms unless it is actually the stakeholders, the rights holders, who explain what the problems are. So this piece is most essential, and we must be clear on expectations. The second is on access to remedy. The guidelines mention grievance mechanisms, but they also, just like most every document we see, repeat the guiding principles. And this is important, but it is a start, it is not a finish. How we actually help companies provide remedy really is the area very missing. So I think the government can help with capacity building, not only in Japan, but with partner governments. And on the issues of priority. How a company prioritizes is not a math problem. So the guidelines are good at saying it's a balance of severity, it's a balance of issues of depth, but we need to be careful, because if you have equally strong and severe issues, then it should not be a trade-off. A company doesn't say we deal with forced labor today and we deal with killings of workers by governments if they protest tomorrow. Some things must be addressed at the same time. So we need to be careful. Now, Japan can also support the business, and it's very important. The first is the issue of how to help SMEs and suppliers globally, but at home. G7 governments, and I hope Japan will commit to capacity building for business too, through help desks, through JETRO, through other, is to provide support so businesses can do the right thing. And similarly, in the area, and the guidelines talk about conflict areas or areas where governments are challenging. This is very important. But I should indicate that businesses should be encouraged, if they can, remain in even in a difficult environment while respecting human rights. So not to just imagine that leaving should be the easy way. We want companies to engage, if they can, responsibly. So in closing, just a few ideas for the future because of Japan's important role. The first is, of course, the G7. A strong, responsible business agenda for the 1 year of the G7 is essential, with all stakeholders being part of that. The second is, I understand that Japan and ASEAN will be commemorating 50 years of their relationship and partnership, another important place. The third is the partnership with UNDP and the working group and others around bringing capacity and partnership throughout the world. And finally, two other areas. We must have policy coherence in trade and investment as well as in the guidelines. So stronger cooperation on what this looks like in trade and investment agreements. And finally, and of course we have here Keidanran from Japan, is using business leaders, so CEOs and other leaders from G7 or from other partner countries to also engage in good practice together. So really encouraging that level of cooperation, not just in government, but civil society platforms and business platforms as well. So again, congratulations. This is a tremendous milestone, but we all have more work to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Anita. Your reflections are, as usual, extremely rich. I won't even attempt to summarize them because we could spend the whole time just recapping them all. Just keywords, leadership, essentiality of stakeholder commitments, policy coherence, and so on and so on and so on. I'm sure we'll come back to that also during the questions. By the way, I'm told we're receiving many questions online. I'm gonna try to take some from the floor as well. But to be able to do that, we should all try to be brief, and I'll start myself by immediately giving the floor to the next speaker, Kun Roonwadi, again, Secretary General of the Security and Exchange Commission of Thailand. Kun Roonwadi, Thailand and Japan have been the two countries in Asia that have been leading this so-called race to the top in terms of policies, policy measures, right? The first two that adopted a NAP, and in both cases, the countries took step further after the adoption of the NAP. We've heard what the government of Japan has just done. The government of Thailand also took additional policy steps after the adoption of the NAP. And in one such case, the Security and Exchange Commission played a very important role because the institution that you had adopted under your leadership an ESG 1 report requirement, which entered into force, I believe, this year. Now, I would like to hear your reflections on what more is needed to transform all this important policy direction into actual change. How do we ensure its implementation? The floor is yours, Kun Roonwadi. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, and sawadee ka. First of all, I'd like to thanks to Mr. Livio and then UNDP for inviting me to share the experience this morning. I would like at the beginning to congratulate the government of Japan for the progress and then the achievement in introducing the guideline, not only for the company themselves, but to the supply chain. I think it's good for the world and the planet that every country move forward on this matter. I must say that human rights is one topic close to my heart. Since my past experience working at the Ministry of Justice, and I think that it's for the question that Kun Livio mentioned, if I bring the audience to first understand what one report is about, right? And then what we have planned in mind to move forward from policy, translate into the action. I have to thanks to the government of Thailand for having asked the Security Exchange of Thailand to be a focal point in moving forward and ensuring all the listed company to respect the UNGP on the human rights. It is already identified clearly in the NAPs back in October 2019. Without that, SEC would not have an active role. All right. But after having NAP mentioned on that, the collaboration with all the stakeholders in capital market have to translate how the policy, such policy, translate into action. Like Mr. Thani mentioned that achievement cannot achieve in one night. We have worked quite a while, 2 years backward, we work together with all related stakeholder in capital market. But I have to say that I have to thanks to the master plan of the capital market in Thailand that have clearly identified that we have to build so-called sustainable capital market. And we have to make sure that we have sustainable finance and investment as well. So that the word of sustainability been there for years. Then we explore how could we achieve that in reality. So that right now, as you mentioned, that we already have mandatory to every listed company. Right now, we have 700 plus listed in the Stock Exchange of Thailand. All size, large size, medium, have to disclose in their one report. We combine many reports in the past to be one: financial and the business performance plus sustainability achievement. The words of accessibility we tackle into area. One is about environment, carbon emission. And the second, this is the topic of today, is human right. So that if you look at the one report of all listed company in Thailand right now, they have already disclosed their achievement so far in the one report. But again, how could we come into the achievement so far? Capacity building is needed, Kun Livio, because as again, human right, something that when we talk into action, it's not that easy, We have the help with UNDP. I have to thanks to Kun Reno as well, and then Kun Kita as well, that we work together, having have entered into MOU early this year. I think that during the past, we have set up a lot of workshop, lots of the training with no cost, This is part of the incentive as well, that we have to work together with the stakeholder. To all the listed company, when we're talking about the listed company, we encourage them to make sure their supply chain to be also involved in their reporting, so that right now we have data on hands already. My colleagues work to make assessment what we need to do even further, because you asked how to make sure the implementation. I think that we have high, if I may, the PwC to make assessment of the current disclosure of one report of all 700, and we will rank and set up the priority what we need to do even further next year. But one thing I have to inform the audience that the HRDD is still a voluntary, and I think that after assessment of this year, we will to think with the stakeholder whether or not we would move up to require the HRDD as mandatory. But again, I have to inform you that it's very pleased that large company, they already disclosed their HRDD in their report already on that. I think that I have to tell you that the success key factor need to come from collaboration. This is the key. I think that I heard panelists mention about this. We cannot act alone. The second that we have to strengthen even more and more is about the capacity building at the SME level and supply chain level. Right now, SCC Thailand tie up with the law faculty, Chulalongkorn University, to provide the HRDD training course. And very pleased to hear that last month, I think, UNDP together with the other four, the SEC, the Right and Liberty Department, Ministry of Justice, and the Global Compact Network set up a so-called BHR Academy as a focal point to enable the understanding about this. I think that we as Professor mentioned, that this is a journey that there's no end. We keep doing with the progress, achievement, and achievement. I think that for the ACC Thailand, we truly work together with listed company, and key success factor in terms of the company themselves need to be, like Kulivero mentioned, leadership of the management, or tone from the top. Tone from the top is the key. And the other side of the coin, we cannot emphasize only the company themselves, but asset owner and investor themselves. And demand side, we work together with Association of Investment Company to make sure whenever they make investment decision, they have to look into ESG as a criteria. And this is the part that I think that demand side, supply side, and the public side be what you call reinforce each other for the benefit and the success of having the business and human right in practice and in reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rungwadi, for passing many very, very important messages. Thank you for bringing in the role of the investors, obviously absolutely critical, for reaffirming the importance of the role of the leaders, for reaffirming the importance of feeding interest with capacity building. As you were speaking, I was receiving some questions and comments from the online participants, which were also pointing to the need of more capacity building. It's definitely something which keeps coming up. Thank you very much, Kunrung Wadi. Let me now turn to Mr. Seki from Keidanren, whom, as I said earlier, is the largest business association of Japan. Keidanren also played an important part in the development of the guidelines, Mr. Seki. I know that Keidanren brought in the perspective, essential perspective, when these policy documents are drafted, perspective of the private sector. Now that they are adopted, what does these directions, in your view, mean for the work on the ground of your member companies with many factories around Asia? How do you think will the adoption of the guidelines influence their relations with their suppliers? And also, how are Japanese companies preparing for their implementation? Thank you. The floor is yours, Mr. Seki.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here and to be able to share what's happening in Japanese business community, and also to share our view on business and human rights. Today, as the task force chair of Keidanren in this field, I would like to introduce some initiatives of Keidanren, which is a comprehensive economic organization with more than 1,400 corporations and industrial organizations as its members. First of all, we welcome that Japanese government established the guidelines in Japan. The guidelines are taken very seriously by Japanese companies. Therefore, we expect significant progress in business and human rights. But even before the formulation of government guidelines, Keidanren has been continuously enhancing its business and human rights initiatives. So I would like to briefly introduce some of them. In order to promote responsible business conduct, back in 1991, Keidanren established Charter of Corporate Behavior, with which member companies pledged to comply. The fifth revision of the Charter in 2017 primarily aimed at proactively delivering on the SDGs through the realization of Society 5.0, which is the Japanese government strategy. And as you see, respecting human rights and promoting human dignity are also highlighted in this revision, both of which are the core values of SDGs. Since then, in addressing SDGs and human rights, Keidanren has been collaborated with UN organizations, including UNDP, based on our MOU. In this revised charter and its implementation guidance, we emphasize the importance of understanding human rights and the human rights due diligence based on the UN guiding principles as the expectation of stakeholders in the global context. And our efforts to promote human rights due diligence, including disseminating information, holding lecture by Dr. John Raggi, webinars with UNDP, ILO, and IOE, and so on. And when we conducted a survey of member corporations in 2020, we found that the number of corporations engaged in human rights due diligence was steadily increasing, but not a few corporations were still taking a wait-and-see approach. Therefore, to raise the level of human rights efforts throughout the Japanese business community, Keidanren again revised its implementation guidance and published Handbook for Management that respect human rights in December last year. The implementation guidance, the upper one, targeted top management of Keidanren's corporate members and describes the matters necessary for top management to understand the importance of human rights and to put them into action. The handbook, the lower one, targeted executives who are responsible for human rights and their staff, provides more specific and practical information with concrete action examples. And we feel that these tools are effective in enabling companies to implement initiatives. And Keidanren also collaborate with industry associations and regional business organizations to promote human rights due diligence through industry or cross-sector initiatives, which is indispensable to bring about the effective solution. I would like to point out that many Japanese companies have been working together with their suppliers or business partners to develop their capabilities and improve health management in the spirit of coexistence and co-prosperity. I believe that this long-term perspective and collaborative approach have become the traditional strength of Japanese companies. Therefore, expanding human rights effort in this spirit will lead to more inclusive and resilient supply chain. Of course, the concept of human rights is broad, and human rights challenge and risks faced by companies vary depending on the industry, size, or country or region in which they operate. Therefore, it is truly effective for companies to respect the human rights of the people involved, using their ingenuity, being creative and proactive based on their own initiatives. I believe that will be the best way to make good use of government guidelines. And on the other hand, on the government side, it is desirable that governments and international organizations cooperate in addressing structural problems that cannot be solved by companies alone, thereby increasing the predictability and safe environment for companies. In summing up, I would like to encourage Japanese companies doing business in Asian countries to utilize the government guidelines. The guidelines incorporate the opinions of private sector, as Keidanren has been actively engaged with that process. As a result, the guidelines provide practical information and useful Q&As. So, by making good use of government, putting emphasis on stakeholder dialogue and collaboration, we will be able to build sustainable, inclusive, resilient, and competitive supply chain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Seki-san. Important messages around the importance again of top management, the executives, the work that Kedan has already done on that, and what I know plans to do out of the discussion we had yesterday. Important encouragement from your side to Japanese companies here in Asia, and I know some are here and many more are tuning in online. Important encouragement coming from Kedan Ren to use the guidelines for respect of human rights, but also for their competitiveness. Thank you again, Mr. Seki. And let me turn to the last of our speakers today, after which, again, I will try to take a few questions from the floor and perhaps mix them with some others that I'm receiving online, and hopefully we will be able to give 1 minute to each of the panelists to make a closing remark. So, Dr. Dina, as a civil society organization which also holds strong expertise in human rights due diligence, first has a strong pulse of the challenges faced by the rights holders. In your case, in Indonesia, where first mostly operate. I would like your views, also as a former member of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. I would like your views on what these guidelines are likely to mean for the Indonesian context, or perhaps more broadly for ASEAN, again, based on your experience as a member of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission. So what are these guidelines, in your view, likely to mean, and what are the next steps needed to ensure that this obviously strong policy commitment is leveraged and translated into positive impact in the life of Asian people? The floor is yours, Dr. Dina.
Thank you very much, Mr. Livio and UNDP, for inviting me to this esteemed forum. It is my honor to also join the speakers in this forum to congratulate the government of Japan and also the people of Japan for the birth of this guideline on respect for human rights in responsible supply chains. A little bit about the Foundation for International Human Rights Reporting Standards. Aside from myself, there are other esteemed experts on human rights, such as Makarim Wibisono, who served in the UN Council, Human Rights Council, Marzuki Darusman, who also served as in various positions as a human rights activist. So us in the context of Indonesia, we are very concerned and committed to advancing, promoting how human rights is not just talked as a norm, but also as something that companies, that actors would actually implement in their daily activities. So the birth of these guidelines to us means a lot. As per 2022, for instance, Japan has over 14,000 companies operating in ASEAN, from consumer goods, automotive, fisheries, and recently also looming everywhere, supermarkets of Japan. And Japan invest a big amount to ASEAN countries. In the future, ASEAN and Southeast Asia in general is the largest and most dynamic market in the world. It will be the center of the world growth, if not it is already. So by having such a guideline adopted by Japan, we are really hoping that the entire stakeholders in Japan would be committed to develop worker skill, improving industrial safety and health, and most importantly, also identify the gaps, the loopholes, any potential adverse human rights impacts in which corporation will be involved. So let me give you one example of what the foundation has done, which is doing a ranking performance of the top 100 corporations doing business in Indonesia. This is just to give a sense of showing that, unfortunately, having a national action plan and then a national guideline doesn't mean a linear path to having a responsible supply chains. As Professor Anita mentioned, the road can be a winding one. So in our experience, we saw that of this 100 public companies being assessed, out of the 100, only 4 express awareness in various ways about human rights. And it shows in their website, sustainability reports, policy statements as their indicators. So the rest remains just basically a talk. 90 of these companies basically performed below 41% in score. That means their human rights management system remains undeveloped, and there are gaps in how they respond to human rights grievances. So they may have human rights grievance mechanism, but they don't follow it up and change it into policy. We also find that ICT companies, international communication, telecommunication companies, scored low, minimal, and very limited. These are the lowest ranking in our scoring performance, which means that the companies who can actually help break barriers where most public eyes may not enter into the companies end up to be those who are less concerned and less implementing in human rights principles. We also find that encouragingly, 90% of these companies, they perform express commitments on gender equality and also on occupational safety and health standards. So these are some encouraging items that we can work on. So by showing this data, I want to show you that this is not supposed to be discouraging data. I would like to see this as a glass half full. Other studies of first this year is supposed to assess whether by the end of this year there has been improvement in these companies. We noticed that companies with multinational presence, such as, let me mention some names who are best in our list, such as Unilever, Indonesia, for instance, Sawit Sumbermas, for instance, it's on palm oil, and then Bumi Resources, that's working on mining, and the other one is pulp and paper, Indah Kiat. So some of these companies with international exposure, they have more interest because they work not just by the books of the government, but they also work by the book of the competitors, their peers. So this is what first would like to highlight. In order for a guideline work effectively, the government somehow must pay attention to how the peers in business doing their work. After all, businesses work by the competition. So they would like to see how other suppliers respond to demands. And this is where consumers' role becomes important. If the consumers are more demanding about responsible business practices and all the lines of suppliers are concerned about it, most likely the businesses will be more responsive. So with that, I would like to end the points. Hopefully that these guidelines will let us bridge the gap, not just expecting the government to do all the work, but we too also will pay attention to how the landscape of businesses is done, not only in Japan in the land, but also in forest, in the seas, in areas that probably no eyes will be able to capture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dina, for bringing in some very important and illustrative data. Thank you for mentioning the role of consumers, for pointing to a glass which is obviously half full and half empty, and pointing to a road which is still long and winding. Our time available to us it's over, but I will abuse 10 minutes of your coffee break, if you don't mind, to try to give the floor to perhaps 2, maximum 3 people, if you're very, so 1 and 2, let's try 1 down there, and 1, 2, and 3. Let's try this one first. So down there, 1, 2, and 3. Please introduce yourself, be very brief, so we'll have a chance to give the floor back to those that you're posing the question to, or to other speakers that may want to comment on your question.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Ryutaro Ogawa from human rights now in Japan. So may I speak in Japanese?
Please do, and there is translation available for everyone.
Okay, thank you. 中谷補佐官、本日ははるばるタイまで来ていただいてありがとうございます。私は昨日こちらのフォーラムのですね、サイドイベントに参加させていただきました。そちらでは韓国、台湾、タイ、ミャンマー、インドの友人と一緒に国別行動計画ですね、各国でどのような状況か、それがどのような実効的なものになっているかということを話し合うという場でした。で、そちらでは、やはりですね、その NAP、国別行動計画などの、その自主的な取り組みでは、なかなか実効性がないと、現場の苦しんでいる被害者の救済につながっていないというのが、一致した結論でした。一方で、このガイドラインを作って、これは一つ大きな進歩だと思うんですけれども、今、モメンタムがある、この日本に対するですね、強い期待も表明していただきました。日本がこの今ガイドラインの流れを利用してやはり義務的な立法法規制を作るべきだと、アジアをリードするべきだというような声もいただきました。でそのことはやはり日本だけの話ではなくて、各国のですね、におけるその義務的立法にも影響を及ぼすと、ポジティブな影響があるので、ぜひ日本でリードを取ってほしいというような期待を私は伝えられました。ぜひせっかくタイに来ていただいたので、そうしたですね、アジア各国からの期待を感じていただきたいと思っています。
Okay.
そして私から
Thank you. Please come to the question if you have, or wrap up, please, so that we can take other comments.
So, 私の質問はですね、このようなアジア各国からの期待に応えるべきではないでしょうか。来年の1月の通常国会にぜひ法案を提出していただきたいと思っています。そうした、今後のですね、義務的な、立法について、このアジア各国からの期待を受け止めて、どのようにお考えかということを、ぜひ伺いたいと思います。
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. More of a comment than a question, I take. Okay. There were two more. One and two. I'm sorry, I cannot take more. One and two down there, please.
ค่ะ
Yeah, let me take the woman.
คาติมาลิจานะคะเป็นชนเผ่าลิซูค่ะวันนี้มาจากเครือข่ายสตรีชนเผ่าแห่งประเทศไทยนะคะเท่าที่มาร่วมในวิธี UN ทั้งหมดวันนี้รู้สึกมีความหวังกับประเทศญี่ปุ่นแล้วก็อยากจะบอกว่าขอบคุณมากๆเราอยากได้แบบนี้มานานแล้วเราได้รับผลกระทบมากมายแต่เราไม่มีทางออกคุณเป็นจุดเริ่มต้นและเราเชื่อมั่นว่าคุณจะเป็นที่ดีแบบอย่างที่ดีและจะมีผลต่อในระดับโลกต่อไปเพราะเราอยากเห็นสันติภาพเราอยากลดความขัดแย้งเราไม่อยากทะเลาะกับใครนะคะแต่ว่าทุกวันนี้มันยังไม่เกิดมันก็แย้งกันอยู่เพราะที่ทำกินของเราที่อยู่ของเราถูกแย่งอะไรอย่างเงี้ยค่ะส่วนฝั่งของตัวแทนรัฐบาลนะคะอย่าถามว่าณตอนนี้ก็มีแนบแล้วอย่างเช่นบ้านตัวเองอะค่ะถูกยึดที่ดินทำกินถูกยึดไปเป็นสัมปทานบ้านกระเบือดินนะคะอยากรู้ว่าเรามีปัญหาแบบนี้ในกลไกแนบของคุณอะเรามีกลไกแบบไหนที่เราเข้าถึงการเยียวยาได้ขอบคุณค่ะ
Thank you. I think again more I believe of a comment, but let's see. Maybe we can give the floor later to somebody if they want to also add to your question. Again, there was one last one down there. The gentleman there in the back, very much in the back, I think had raised their hand first. Yes.
Thanks very much. My name is Lo Chao. I'm from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. My question is actually very similar to Ryotaro-san from Human Rights Now. So we have heard time and time again from this forum, representatives from many countries saying that voluntary measures do not work in their countries, urging governments to transition to mandatory human rights due diligence. So my question is whether there is any plan for Japan to take further steps to advance to mandatory human rights due diligence in future. And for business representatives on the panel, what is the business community's stance on possibly having that kind of instruments in the future? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. So I see that Mr. Nakatani would like to make a comment and response. So the floor is to Mr. Nakatani, and then since I think the business sector was also asked to share their views on mandatory human rights due diligence, perhaps Mr. Seki. And I'm afraid after that, unless there's any panelists that really wants to make a comment, I'll have to close. So please, Mr. Nakatani.
小川さんどうもありがとうございました。デューデリデンスの法律化につきましては、排除はされておりません。これはやりながらですね、検討していくということにしておりまして、まずはガイドラインの実施を取り組みます。というのは大企業もあれば中小企業もありますので、こういったことをできるところからやって、だんだんと拡大をしていくということと、それからNGO、皆様方の貢献もですね、非常にありがたいわけでありますので、市民社会との共同などもですね、どのように行っていくかということで、とにかくこれをスタートしてですね、こういったものがしっかり定着するようにですね、進めていきたいというふうに考えております。
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Nakatani. And now the floor to Mr. Seki, please.
Yes, thank you for the question and comments. In my opinion, of course, make it mandatory is one policy measures, but more than that, capacity building is very, very important at this stage. And of course, human rights issue is very complex and it cannot be solved overnight. And the good news is 4 years ago, when we conducted a survey to member companies, the number of percentage of companies who conducted human rights due diligence is only 30%, 30. But last year, Japanese government made the same kind of survey, and this time the result was 50%. So it's a clear indication of the progress. But I know that this is not enough, still not enough. So capacity building, especially for senior management level persons, and in addition, capacity buildings to government officials or local government officials and consumers. Capacity building is very, very important, and we should try every effort to promote awareness and capacity building.
Thank you, Mr. Seki. I'm really sorry for not having been able to give the floor to more of you that had many questions. Normally speakers remain available outside during coffee breaks, and so I encourage you all to approach them and ask the questions directly. I want to thank you all participants for your patience, also for giving us 10 minutes of your coffee break, and of course, big thanks to all of our speakers today. So please join me in giving them one more round of applause. Thank you very much.